Hello Sugar Geeks, Liz here. So today we are going to learn how to make your very first loaf of sourdough bread. This is a video for beginners. So if you're a sourdough expert, this will probably be a very boring video for you. In this video, we're gonna go over all those confusing terms like LEVAIN and autolyse and stretch and folds, and I'm gonna break it down like you've never made sourdough before, because that's what I was looking for when I was learning how to make sourdough. All that's coming up next on the Sugar Geek Show. So the first thing we need to do is talk about our starter. If you do not have a starter that's active and doubling and peaking, and if any of these words are confusing you, you might want to check out my previous video on how to make your own sourdough starter. Or if you have a friend who has an established starter, get some from them. The great thing about making your own starter though is that you will learn a ton about what it takes to make starter grow, what it needs to thrive and be big and strong so it can make big puffy loaves of dough. And then you get to name it. This is my new sourdough starter, Will the Yeast. And this is my first starter that I ever made, April. And Will the Yeast is actually the most active of the two right now. So I'm gonna use our new starter to make this loaf of bread. So how do you know if your starter is ready to use? Well, you're gonna make something called a LEVAIN. LEVAIN, I'm not sure which way you pronounce that. LEVAIN is basically sourdough starter. Is exactly the same thing what it's made up of, but LEVAIN refers to sourdough starter when it's at its peak. What is a peak? A peak is the highest point that the starter will reach before it starts to fall again. So its most active point is the peak. It's when it's its strongest, it's when it's eating a ton. That's when you want to use it. So this starter was fed last night at about 10 o'clock at night before I went to bed. And I can see, because it's kind of a dirty jar, I can see that it peaked right up here, but it's not at that point anymore. It's way down here. So is this starter at its peak? No, it's way past its peak and it needs to be fed. So what I'm gonna do is, before I feed my starter, like I normally do every day, and then use the discard to make pancakes or whatever, I'm gonna make a LEVAIN. If you try to use this to make your bread, it might work or it might not. So that's what people refer to when they mean LEVAIN or LEVAIN. So my recipe for LEVAIN is 50 grams unfed starter, 50 grams whole wheat flour, and 50 grams of bottled water. But I want this to be warm, 90 degrees preferably. That takes about 5 seconds in the microwave. We make the water warm because it jump starts the yeast and says, hey, here's a perfect environment for you to start growing. And then I always mark where it has started because it's good to know. And then you can track to make sure that it's rising. You just need this to double within 5 hours. Mine triples within 3 hours, so I know it's definitely ready. But every starter is different because it's alive. So what I do is I mix up my LEVAIN and I put it on top of my countertop over here, and then I start my dishwasher. And that warmth and humidity really makes my starter happy. So that's how I get my LEVAIN going in the morning time. I had these little erasable markers that I use to mark right there. So I'm just gonna cover this and put it in a warm spot to do its thing. If you're interested, I highly recommend you go to the blog post and download my PDF workflow sheet. This is every step that we're talking about right now, all mapped out in a workflow, and then you can just mark off which one that you do. Boom, has times and each step that I'm describing here. So this helps you just keep track and rein in the crazy and you know, not lose track of where you are. So right after you make your LEVAIN, you want to make your autolyse. Autolyse basically refers to the period of time where you have combined the flour and water, just flour and water, no salt, nothing else, and you let it absorb, you let the water absorb into the flour, which activates the gluten, and then you can start a series of things called stretch and folds. I do this at the same time I make my LEVAIN, otherwise I will forget. And it doesn't hurt your flour and water to be sitting for hours. Most recipes say to do the autolyse 30 minutes before your levain peaks, but how do you know when it's gonna peak? So I just do it right now. All right, so to make our autolyse, I'm gonna take my bowl and place it on the scale, turn it on, and just make sure that it says 0. Then I'm going to add in 300 grams of bread flour. I like to use bread flour because it has more gluten in it. It's stronger. It's able to hold its shape with all of this water. Sourdough bread is a very, very wet bread. It is not like any other bread that you've ever used. So just remove all that information about kneading and what dough should feel like, because sourdough is its own thing. You can also use all-purpose flour. It's just going to be a little bit of a looser dough, even looser than it already is. So your bread might not rise quite as high. It's okay. Just might have to do a couple extra stretch and folds to make it strong. 100 grams of whole wheat, and then 100 grams of all-purpose flour. You don't have to add the all-purpose. You can just replace it with bread flour if you want a stronger loaf, but I think the all-purpose adds a little bit of softness to the crumb. So total of 500 grams of flour. I'm gonna press tare to get rid of all of that. Now I'm gonna add my water, 400 grams. As you start learning more about making sourdough, you will learn that there are many, many, many different variations of flour and levain and different brands of flour and different kinds of flour like rye and spelt and all this stuff. This is just a basic beginner loaf. All right, so we're gonna take our hand and then just mix all this together. Notice the water was just room temperature. It doesn't need to be warm. So when you combine the flour with the water at first, the flour and water is not really one. It's kind of still two separate things. And you have this very rough, shaggy dough. You might hear that word when you're learning more about sourdough. And if you try to stretch this right now, it just tears. It has no elasticity whatsoever. And then what happens is, as this sits for 30 minutes, the water absorbs into the flour and it becomes super stretchy. It's amazing. It's super interesting. Okay, so after you make your autolyse, you just put the plastic wrap on it, and then we're just gonna set it aside until our levain is ready. I set a timer for about an hour, so I'll just check my levain every hour and see how it's progressing. If it's going really slow, I might just put it in the oven with the light on to give it a little bit of boost because it's warmer in there, but usually it does pretty good on the countertop. All right, we're back. Our levain has tripled. It's been about 4 hours, so that's great. Our autolyse has been hanging out and it's ready to go. So now we're on the step of making the dough. I'm gonna measure out 11 grams of pink Himalayan sea salt because that's what I use in all of my cooking. I like the flavor of it. We're also gonna need a little bit of water to dip your hand in. This dough is extremely wet, so you don't use flour to stop it from sticking to stuff. You actually use water. So just for fun, let's look and see how stretchy this is now. Remember before when it was breaking a lot? I'm gonna dig my hands in here. Look at that. That is some stretch. So that is definitely well hydrated. So now we're gonna add in our levain. You need 140 grams, but I just put it all in there because once you kind of account for the bit that sticks to the container, it's about 140. And then we're gonna take our salt, sprinkle that on there. And first you just kind of use your fingers to sort of push it into the dough below. And then we're going to pull up and bring it over the front. Pull, fold. This is called a stretch and fold, and you need to get really used to this action because we'll be doing that a lot over the next few hours. And then we do something called a pincher technique. I learned this from Ken Forkish in his book, Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. It's a great book, super great guy to learn from. You basically just take your hand, You squeeze until it pinches through the dough like that. So you end up with these little nuggets. And it's just kind of a way to distribute that yeast throughout everything. And then you just kind of fold it all back together again. And you can feel that it's just starting to get tight. You can feel that gluten is starting to get wound up. So it starts to make sense in your mind. Okay, I see why we do these stretch and folds and how it can start to develop the gluten in this once very loose chunk of flour. It's now starting to become a cohesive piece of dough. So when I do this, I just do it very, very quickly. It takes like literally a minute. I just kind of pinch, 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 maybe 3 or 4 times until I can't see any chunks of levain left in there. And it all just feels like a cohesive blob, right? Okay, done. All right, so making dough, step 3. You can mark that off. That's done. So now we're just going to cover this and let it rest for 30 minutes. And then our step 3 will be done and we will be moving into stretch and fold. So I'm gonna set my timer and we will be back to do our first set of stretch and folds. All right, it's been about 30 minutes. I'm gonna do our first stretch and fold. So remember, our dough right now is like an unraveled ball of yarn. It has no strength. It just lays lifeless in a pool. And every time we do a stretch and fold, it's like taking those unraveled pieces and wrapping them back into a ball. And then it relaxes and it might stretch out again, and then you wrap it back up in a ball. So when you're doing these stretch and folds, it'll say 3 or 4 times because it just depends on the type of flour you're using and how strong it is. For me, I usually only have to do these stretch and folds about 4 times before the dough really, I can just feel that it's holding its shape more and it's okay to stop doing the stretch and folds. If you're using all-purpose flour, which is not as strong as bread flour, you might need to do like 6 stretch and folds. So with that in mind, remember that we have added the levain to this dough. So the levain is starting to make the dough rise. We're gonna have an hour between each stretch and fold, and in that hour, the levain is making the dough rise. And we just kind of keep an eye on it. Depending on how hot your room is, it might only take 6 hours for it to get super bubbly. It might take 8. So you just have to keep an eye on your dough. I do like to mark mine. So I'll put a mark on the side right here, so I know that's where my dough was when I first started doing my stretch and folds. And I'm kind of looking for this to double in size. Does that sound familiar? Just like if you were making bread with regular active yeast, you wait for your dough to double in size. We just happen to be kneading ours at the same time. Well, stretching and folding. So the way you do a stretch and fold is you reach underneath your dough like this. And you just lift up. Ooh, that's so stretchy. And then you just fold it over and tuck it in on the side. And at first it's gonna be really stretchy and stretch a lot. Make sure your hands are wet or it's gonna stick. But as you do this, you'll notice that the gluten starts getting tighter. And that's exactly what we want to happen. Rotate 45 degrees. Pull up. Oh, see, I can feel it's getting tighter. You pull it as far as it will pull without tearing it. We don't want to tear that beautiful gluten. We just want to stretch it. And there, we're done. Now look, it's in like a ball shape because we've wound all of that loose yarn into a ball. And it's going to relax over the next hour. It's going to puff up a little bit, all normal things, and then we will do another stretch and fold. Just make sure you set a timer because otherwise you'll forget about it. If at any point you're making sourdough and you're like, shoot, I have to go somewhere, I don't have time to do the stretch and fold, put your dough into the fridge, and that is basically like saying pause, stop rising yeast, don't do anything until I come back. So I like to make a little note on step 4 when I do my stretch and folds, what time it was, so I know what stretch and fold I'm on because there's an hour in between each one. So I know I've done one. I'll come back when it's time to do two. Okay, another hour has gone by. Our dough has relaxed and has spread out quite a bit. That's good. Time to do our stretch and folds. I can starting to see some little bubbles in here too. That's good. I start to feel like the dough is starting to get like kind of a spongy texture to it. Kind of feels a little bit lighter. It's hard to explain. You can just feel like there's more air in there. And I just kind of pick it all up and make sure that all of the seams are on the bottom. And that's it. That is fold number 2. We'll set our timer for another hour. All right, we're back. Another hour has gone by. This is stretch and fold number 3. I can definitely feel it's getting puffier. Stretch to the point where it won't pull any further. When I fold over, I really try and tuck it over the side so that it doesn't shrink back to where it was, because you want that gluten to stay nice and tight. And then I kind of pick it all up and get all the edges tucked under the bottom, and we're done. So I do feel like this gluten is developing nicely, but I am going to do one more stretch and fold, so I'm going to set my timer for an hour. You might be stressed out like, how do I know if I've done enough stretch and folds, or how have I not? Part of that is just practice, honestly. Try out this recipe and make it 10 times and you will get a feel for it. You will definitely see when something is not doing what you want it to, and then you can make adjustments. Just don't like bounce from recipe to recipe to recipe, because that will just be confusing for you and you won't know what's working and what's not working. Okay, it's our last fold. Well, for this portion. You can see that the sourdough has flattened out, but not completely. It's still got some roundness to it. There's definitely some bubbles happening there, all good signs. I should also mention that it is 72 degrees in my house. Not super hot, but pretty warm, so that it rises pretty well just sitting here on the countertop. If you have a cold house, less than 70 degrees, you might want to put it in the oven with just the light on, or on top of the oven with the light on, or if you have a bread proofer, that's a really good spot to put it. Very poofy now. You can definitely feel lots more air developing in there. We're handling our dough gently. We don't want to knock that air out, but you shouldn't really be concerned about popping any large bubbles or anything like that, because we're going to pop them anyways. I can barely get 3 folds. See how it's just starting to pull back on itself? So it's definitely ready to stop doing the stretch and folds. When it starts being too difficult to even do a stretch and fold, you have developed enough gluten. Just tucking everything underneath there. So now we're gonna do the bulk ferment. Like I said, technically, it's already been bulk fermenting. It's already rising and getting bigger, but now I'm just not gonna even touch it for the next hour or 2. And what I'm gonna do is just keep an eye on it and look for it to be doubling in size. All right, it's about an hour and 40 minutes later, and I'm gonna finish this bread up. If you look, it's definitely risen a lot. It's very loosey-goosey in the bowl. I see lots of big bubbles under the surface. If you look at the side where that line was, it's definitely doubled. It's a little bit hard to tell in a bowl because it slopes outward, but you can definitely tell. So the first thing we're gonna do is get our table a little bit wet. It's gonna help it not stick, and just dump your dough out. All right, it's very loose. So now you should just be able to gently grab it and stretch it out into a large rectangle shape. Try not to knock out any of the air that's in the dough, but if you see any huge bubbles, it's okay to pop those. I actually don't have too many. So now we're gonna fold this like a book. This is the same kind of fold you would do if you're laminating dough to make croissants. And it's a way of kind of just like folding everything together to evenly distribute the butter. But in this case, we're evenly distributing the bubbles. So you can get a nicer crumb and it looks better when you cut into it. So we're going to take this edge that's right here and bring it to the middle. Lift up, just like that. Try and get the corners all aligned, pop any big bubbles that you see on the surface. Okay, and then take the other end, fold it over right on top just like that. Okay, and now we're going to roll this dough up like a cinnamon roll. And what this is going to do is just further tighten that gluten, really get it wound up tightly, and also distribute those bubbles really nicely. So you just pull and roll, nice and tight. And then you can tuck the edges down underneath if you want to, but I don't really bother with it at this point. Look how tall our loaf is sitting right now. It's because that gluten is really tight. So if you have a problem with your dough just kind of still pooling out at this point, it just needs to be folded more and get that gluten tighter. So now I'm just going to take this bowl that we had before that will definitely need some soaking in water to clean. And we're just going to put that on top, and we're going to do something called the bench rest, which is basically just to give time for that seam to seal up and close so that it further holds its shape. Then we're going to shape it one more time, put it in its banneton to go night-night. All right, we're in the home stretch. Literally, I'm going to stretch. It's funny. All right, I'm gonna put a little bit of flour in my banneton. I got this off of Amazon. It's just a really simple kind of like basket with a liner in it that just you put your dough into proof. But before I got this, I used a bowl with a tea towel. A tea towel is not like a terry cloth towel, it's smooth. So it's kind of like a napkin, like this. So you can just put this on top of your bowl, dust it with flour, and you have kind of a homemade banneton. But I like toys, so I have this. I also have a lom, which is basically a razor blade on a stick. And it's great for doing fancy scoring, which we're gonna do tomorrow. If you don't have a lom, which I don't know why you would if you're watching a beginner sourdough video, you can use an X-Acto blade, or you can just use a regular razor blade and hold it in your hand, or you can use a chopstick or a skewer to put it on. All kinds of fun little DIY things you can do. You don't have to have anything. All right, let's check on our bread here. You can see it's still holding its shape fairly well. I'm gonna get my hands wet again. And I'm gonna turn her over like that. And I'm going to gather up all of the edges and make like a little dumpling. And then I'm gonna pick the whole thing up and plop it into my banneton. And that way it just tightens the skin for putting it into the banneton, and it will hold its shape better. Boop, just like that. Still have a couple of big bubbles I'm popping. Those big bubbles are just trapped air, and they make kind of ugly holes in your bread, so it's okay to pop them. All right, so now you can just kind of seal up the bottom just by pinching your fingers together. And I'm gonna put this in a plastic bag. So I have this big plastic bag. These are used for bread making, but you could use like a turkey roaster bag. Don't use a trash bag though. And this just keeps the bread from drying out in the fridge. You could just use plastic wrap too if that's all you have. And just kind of make it so that there's some air trapped in there a little bit so it doesn't touch the bread. Twist, fold underneath. And now this is gonna go into the refrigerator overnight. It is 7 o'clock right now. I'm gonna take this out probably around 9 o'clock. How long it stays in the refrigerator, it really doesn't matter. Because remember, it's not doing anything while it's in there. So you could leave it in there for 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours. Just keep in mind that it will get more sour over time. So that's one way that you can control the sour level of your bread. This is gonna be plenty sour though for me. I don't like a ton of sourness, so I just do overnight. Okay, here we are 24 hours later from when we started this bread. Can you believe it? I myself only bake bread maybe 3 times a week. So I just leave my starter on the countertop and just feed it and use the discard for other little goodies like pancakes, or you can make pizza dough, focaccia. Just look up sourdough discard recipes and there's a ton of stuff on there. If you just don't want to bake bread for a while, you can put your starter in the fridge and take it out when you're ready to bake again. Make sure you check out the link above for the full blog post. Okay, so my oven is hot, 500 degrees, very, very hot. I have my Dutch oven already in there because I also want it to be hot. If you don't have a Dutch oven, you can just bake right on top of a sheet pan or a pizza stone if you have one, and just put like a roasting lid over the top, or even like a stainless steel bowl. So there's a ton of different ways that you can do that, but if you have a Dutch oven, that works really well. The way that we transfer this bread to the oven is I have like a 9 by 9 inch or 10 inch by 10 inch piece of parchment paper, not wax paper, parchment paper. And I just put that on the back here, and that serves as a way to be able to pick up the dough and transfer it to the Dutch oven. And then you can just flip it over and pull it out of that banneton really easily. And you can see it's holding its shape very nicely. So now what we want to do is do some scoring. So the main score that I do is the C shape, where you just kind of go, if this is the middle line and this is the edge, about halfway between, you just do a big C. And that just helps the bread expand, and it gets this little thing called an ear, which is sort of in fashion right now. It's very trendy for your bread to have ears. But any way you want to score your bread is totally okay. You can look up some YouTube videos on how to do like ornamental scoring, you know, and make it look like flowers and lace and all that fun stuff. I don't really care so much about that, ironically. I just like to do a little bit of a decorative score on the side, and then the main ear. So I just take some flour and I just kind of brush that over the surface because I like the look of a little bit of contrast. I don't want to do too much because otherwise it gets really cakey. Just enough so that as it bakes, you'll be able to see the difference between what my scoring is and the bread. I have my beautiful lamb here. So I'm going to do the C first, and you want to dig in 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. And then I'm just going to quickly do my little decorative scoring. I like to just do this little wheat. I make a line just kind of barely through the surface, not pressing super hard. And then a little line for the stem, and then I just do one little smaller one off to the side. And that's it. And then I'm going to quickly transfer it to the Dutch oven by just opening the oven, taking the lid off, grab the parchment by the corners, just kind of drop it down in there, put the lid back on, close everything back up, and then reduce the temperature to 475 and set your timer for 30 minutes. All right, it's been 30 minutes. It's the moment of truth, my favorite moment, when we get to see how well our bread is rising. Oh yes, beautiful. Oh, that's looking gorgeous. All right, close it back up, put it back in. Love it. All right, I'm gonna set my timer for another 25 minutes. Smells amazing. As you can see, it looks very nice. I'm gonna let it cool down for maybe 5 or 10 minutes in the pot, and then I will just take it out and let it cool down for another hour before I slice it. That's really hard to wait, I know, but if you cut it too soon, it's gonna be gummy and ruin all your hard work. So be patient. Okay, it's been about an hour, and honestly, I just cannot wait any longer to eat this bread. It smells so good, it's killing me. So we're gonna go ahead and cut into it. I always like to cut my bread straight in half the first time around just to see what the interior crumb looks like. Nice, sharp, serrated knife is your friend. Look at that, beautiful. I'm always so nervous. You see that beautiful crumb? Nice and open, but not too open. Perfect for some butter. So while this does taste amazing, fresh out of the oven, you can just wrap it up in that same plastic bag that we used for proofing. Keep it at room temperature. And the crust does start to get softer as it sits, and it really tastes better if you refresh it for just maybe like 5 minutes in the toaster oven or in your regular oven, and it just makes it warm and brings that crispness back to your bread again. A lot of people eat their sourdough bread with olive oil. I'm just a fan of a big slathering of butter. And then just look how that beautiful crumb, how stretchy and pillowy and soft it is. It's amazing. It never gets old. It was so good. So that's it, guys. That is how you make your very own first loaf of sourdough bread. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. If it has, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.